So Shane, in all this discussion, we've talked quite a bit about past histories, about the evolution of our structures and our systems, the evolution of just how wild harvest has come forward to us. But today, we have a lot of pressures on our landscapes, on our cultural acceptances. There's a lot of things that could influence the direction this wild harvest and the sustaining mechanisms of the North American model, our ability to let people participate. There's a lot of things that could change the direction of that.
There are, and this is one of those. It's one of those questions or one of those observations that when you set it up as kind of a horizon to look at, you start to think about a lot of layers in the circumstance. First of all, we have the growth of the population globally and the growth of the population in our own countries. We all see it.
Yeah.
And we all see, too, at the same time, there's a challenge in providing equitably resources for all people in our countries, and we don't succeed perfectly with that by any means. And we also see the phenomenon of the more advantaged in our societies wanting to take onto themselves more and more of the beautiful landscapes that are available. It's a natural thing. People want to have beauty around them, and if they have the wherewithal to acquire it, they're not malicious about it. It's just that's something almost all of us would try to do if we could. But that's bringing sometimes a series of value clashes too, as people from one part of a country come to another and are not quite totally familiar with the culture that may take place there, and then, they may want to see things changed. So that is a phenomenon that's going on. You have the political landscape in any country that evolves over time and goes through periods of, more or less calm or more or less tension. And depending on where that interlude is, that has effects, of course, policies and laws, and which government comes to power determines often, the direction things may take. All of those things are providing us with an extraordinarily challenging and dynamic circumstance. And so as one looks at that horizon with that question of the challenges we face and that could undermine the systems that we have, we do have to take a long-term view, both backward and forward, to help us understand the variability that can take place in those systems, and yet we can still achieve, and try to get some idea of the variability and the problems that really, if we allow them to reach a certain scale, will be the end of things, will really bring it down. And those are big challenges. It takes a lot of thinking and a lot of information gathering to put together impressions about all of that. We have seen, of course, a major decline in the participation of hunting in the last 10, 15 years.
Right.
And the greatest threat of all, however, is not just the decline in participation, it's the demographics of the hunting community, the age categories of the hunting community.
Yeah.
We are tipping towards a point where a lot of us lemmings are going to go over the cliff. And so...
That's great, lemming.
Yeah. So there may not be enough little lemmings coming behind us. And so, this is the most powerful problem we have sort of internally to the issue of the hunting world. And we're trying to address that with, programs like R3, retention, recruitment, reactivation. My personal view is, if we cannot turn it around with wild food, we're not going to turn it around with anything.
I would agree with that.
That's where it is. And young people today are very concerned about their bodies. They're very concerned about health. They're very concerned about longevity. They're very concerned about what they eat and where it comes from and so on and so forth. So I think it's perfect timing for the social wave, if you will, that we are in at the present time. The other things, however, that are pressing against us are political circumstances that can lead to decisions that can affect not directly the right of people to hunt or fish, but issues of access to landscapes where that kind of activity can take place. And sometimes that can be a conflict between, public versus private land interests, because private land is owned by private citizens who can determine who can have access to their land. And that has been and can be, and this is true in Europe even, access can be a real problem. And then in some cases, access is allowed, but at a very high cost. And then that works against the very demographic nature, because I may not be able to afford that. Randy might be able to afford that. And then it sets up a very different kind of dynamic. So I see all of those challenges. And then there are matters of urgency. It is like, a government may come to power, such as the government of today in your country. And it may wish to invoke policies on something, for example, like oil and gas extraction, and have a slightly different perspective, or markedly different perspective, let's say, from a former government. But then suddenly something happens in the world, like an invasion of an autonomous country by another, displacing millions and millions of people and killing tens of thousands of them and destroying essentially every city that it's possible for them to destroy at the present time. You have that happen, and it sends reverberations to the global economy, and the energy economy is deeply affected, and suddenly now we have to do what we have to do. And so you see reversal of some of the decisions and plans.
Right.
And extractive activities on the land, logging, agriculture, energy extraction, etc., mining, they can all have impacts on wildlife, and they can all have impacts on the quality of the environment. And in some cases, they can change the makeup of the wildlife community in a particular area. Certainly logging can do that, timber harvesting.
Right.
And all of those things are out there, but for many of the industries, I feel we've come a long way. I don't think we've come far enough, but I think we've come a long way, Randy, in the last 25 years, let's say,
For sure.
in moving things in a more positive direction. And I always try to point out about, whenever in a discussion of ideas, ideas never move smoothly forward. There's always little eddies, Even as an idea is gaining traction, there's somewhere, there's a community, there's an entity, there's a body, there's a thinking that is working sort of to some extent in the opposite direction. So we may imagine all these threats to the environment generally, some of which pose threats to hunting, angling, and other activities of harvesting. But at the same time, suddenly now we see the world coming to recognize, in a rapid series of exchanges at the global level, of just how vitally important living natural foods, including wildlife species and fish species, are to us, and that the notion that we should suddenly stop harvesting wild things would essentially mean, world fisheries alone would mean, that about 2 billion people would immediately enter, food deprivation.
Yeah.
And somewhere near 600 to 700 million people would be immediately unemployed, et cetera, et cetera. And so the consequence is A, or B, you develop more sustainable international fisheries and you manage to keep feeding lots of people. So we're trying very hard to go in that direction. So at the same time that some people would argue we should stop hunting, Randy, because it's an anachronism or it's cruel or whatever, there are other people recognizing that, when you think more about this, the idea of eliminating all hunting, and I consider all world fisheries hunts, of eliminating all hunting would have absolutely devastating consequences for probably half to 2/3 of the people on this planet.
Yeah.
And so this is what I mean. You can have one idea that's racing out to end it all. Then you can have another idea spinning here, creating turbulence for that trajectory by saying, now, wait a minute, we actually got to go back and think a little bit more about this and realize how important these are. And then at the same time, you have a health system that has traditionally, over the last 50 to 75 years, promoted pharmaceutical creations as a fundamental way of dealing with human health problems. But what we have seen in the last 25 years, one of these tailwinds, one of these vortices, something completely different, arguing, you know what? We wouldn't actually need nearly as much of that stuff if we were just walking a little more and feeding ourselves a little better and getting more natural foods and so on and so forth. And so this is the way it always is. And the question for humanity is to try to find, first of all, to get ahead of these ideas just a little bit, to get ahead of them in a way to know how to develop solutions that will be acceptable to people. Because acceptability is not about it being right. Acceptability is often just about timing.
Yeah.
I think the Wild Harvest Initiative has arisen, and of course it was deliberately, these factors were in my mind, obviously. Mm-hmm. It is perfectly designed to take advantage, as we talked a little bit earlier, about these trends that are ongoing in society towards health and fitness and so on. So my belief is that there is no question that we can list an enormous array of challenges to this activity, some of which, as I said, are internal, like our own demography, and some of which are external to groups that simply don't approve of the activity and lobby against it and so on. But I think if you take the higher view and you look at where this is all headed globally, I think we see a world in which these activities are going to be respected.
Yeah.
They are going to endure. And it places an enormous responsibility on people like us, by us, not just you and me, but all of us in this room and all of us everywhere, to make sure that we are representing those activities in the best possible way.
Yeah.
And we're beginning also to see a way for private lands more and more to engage with the community of harvesters. Mm-hmm. Now there's controversies around this.
Always is.
Always are controversies.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change the fact that there now is an active pursuit of finding models, if you will, or circumstances under which wildlife on private land, can be hunted by not just landowners themselves, but by others. And this, of course, is part of the recognition, too, that somehow the private landowner needs to be, in a sense, compensated in some way for certain damages that occur as a result of helping to maintain abundant wildlife for us all. And a big motivation in those circumstances, I think, is for, hunters who are interested in harvesting animals that they, in fact, are going to consume.
Yeah.
So this opens up a whole other dimension of things, right? That's it's not simple.
No, not simple. But when you think about every time a pivot point or a surge in what our cultures are experiencing, the leadership and the visionary and the successes that move that activity or that idea forward come from looking at what our challenges and where may be the darkest clouds, but what are solutions and attributes and benefits that can go forward. So when you're talking about us just having been through a world pandemic, us having a war in Europe, there's all these things that we could look at and say, oh no, this is the beginning of the end, or however dramatic you want to be about it. But as you've been talking, you've been rattling off all of these different ways in which wild harvest, health, food, the activities are solutions to a bunch of these things that
they are.
So they really represent opportunities for us.
Yes.
To further the idea and further the notion of wild harvest, if we look at it as opportunities.
Yes, and I mean, one of the things that I want to speak about animal welfare a little bit, but one of the things that we have to think about with this initiative, we are bringing together all of the data on all the harvests and figuring out the body weights, the amount of consumable meat that comes from each animal, how many meals that would generate by species, by region, by political place, state, province, etc. And we're looking at, food costs, Nielsen ratings costs for meats and so on as sold in various parts of the country and coming up with an economic estimate of the value. We're looking at how widely that food is shared, how many millions and millions of other people who don't hunt are actually sharing in that food, which suggests to me that they probably are not vehemently opposed to hunting if they're accepting it, which is a fabulous way of keeping their support too, because they see the generosity of people. I mean, we're looking at all of those kinds of things, and there's no question in my mind that, sort of like a series of nested dolls, when we get through this first big wave of here are all the statistics from the hunting surveys, and here are all the data points from the amounts of meat, amount of food, what it's worth, and so on and so forth, then there's going to be this incredible next series of events that will take place, predictably, at least as I see it. And we only have to look at how the model worked to see that this it will likely happen. There will be sociologists and economists and other researchers that will jump on this data and say, no, some of that's wrong, or jump on it and say, that's amazing, but I was thinking of it from this perspective and another purpose. And, and then there undoubtedly will be people who will look at the Wild Harvest Initiative data and they will say, all right, we really now need to start thinking about maximizing the amount of wildlife we can raise and selling the meat. And that will generate a whole series of debates and discussions, right? Whether we should or whether we should not, and so on and so forth, following more the European systems, etc. So I think another wonderful thing about this program is that it's going to be never-ending. I mean, my hope is that this is going to generate its own life, just like the model did. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of at the stage, we were at with the model, Randy, 25 years ago. First, when we started talking about the model, after Geist laid it down, there were people who said, we don't have a model, that's ridiculous, blah, blah. And all those kinds of debates went on. We got nasty emails and, nasty phone calls, and people wouldn't look at you at conventions and all this kind of stuff. But now it's mainstream. Yeah. I mean, there it is. It's out there. And it still has its detractors, but there it is. And I think this program is going to have an even bigger impact because I think it can affect people in many more ways. Because the North American model has often been criticized, and to some extent justifiably, that it has a major focus on the hunting community and so on. And a lot of us who talk about it are hunters and so forth. But the wild harvesting is going to include people who will not be hunters, but who will be wild harvesters in their own rights for other products. And I think, therefore, this has a chance to be a much more inclusive phenomenon. And the other thing I would say is, as you know, I am a very strong proponent of animal welfare. Mm-hmm. And my fundamental beliefs, which I've expressed many times, is that there is no difference between our own species and the others. And I have believed that since I was a boy, and I believe it to this day, and I'm certain I'm not going to change my mind. And so I'm also practical, however, and I realize that we cannot feed the world as we have made it now without industrialized agriculture, and some aspects of that, no matter how hard we try, will not be ideal from my perspective of how animals ought to live or how they ought to die. And, we cannot raise enough chickens by letting them out in the fields to just run around. There are tens and tens of millions, and gather them up and get into market. Yeah. And we can't do that with pigs either. They are a different animal too. Once they're out there, as we know, based on wild pig populations, you don't get them back. Right. And good luck controlling them. We can do better things, of course, with cattle and with sheep, and we have done fantastic things in many cases with ranching and with sheep, because we're moving into the grass-fed, free range, a lot of that. But I believe ultimately, every one of those animals, no matter how beautiful they are, no matter how interesting they are, because, from my home in Harbour Grace in Newfoundland, I look across the harbour, and on the far side of the harbour, there's a piece of land called the Feather, which is a long, about 4 to 5 mile stretch of relatively low coastline, and it's a communal pasture. And so I can look out in the mornings, and I can see the sheep over there, and I can see the cattle over there, and so on. Gannets are diving, right in front of them, and this is this beautiful mosaic of integrated living, really, that's there. And the small fishing boats are coming out of the harbor, fishing for crab and lobster and shrimp and everything. It's quite extraordinary. And so you see it all happening there in a beautiful kind of oneness. But the wild animal is born in nature. The wild animal lives to purpose. In other words, every talent, every behavior that was ever developed by those animals are exercised. They find the reality in the natural environment. They experience wind, and snow, and sun, and rain, and the seasonality explosion of forage, and they run from predators, and they develop their own strategies, and they are free to mate in the way that mating in their species is meant to do, forming harems, and depending on the species, and all of these kinds of things. And they live their lives, maybe 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, 18 years, depending again on the species. A moose lives a very long time and be quite old when you hunt it. The other species are quite a bit younger. But the truth of the matter is that they live their lives to the fullest extent possible. We do not know of any way to enhance the wild animal's life more than the wild animal's life is.
Yeah.
And after all this time living with them, we don't know how to do that. And nor perhaps do we need to even think about that. And then we enter the picture, by we, humans, enter the picture, as we have for the last tens of thousands, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 years. And now with the weaponry that we have, the precision rifles and when people shoot bows really well and can handle that weaponry well, very often we take the animal. If we're lucky as hunters, and every hunter who's any good at what he does or she does will admit the fact that if we all had our choice, it would be the single bullet to the spine, and that would be the end of that.
Yeah.
It always isn't possible, but even if it is a lung or a heart shot, which will be lethal to the animal, no question, the amount of pain and the period of pain, certainly the period of pain is quite brief. It's very short. All animals die, all human beings die. That's inevitable. It's how we live. It's how we live that's critical. And we can only go so far with industrialized agriculture in improving the circumstances for how they live. We can become good at perhaps how they die under those circumstances, but believe me, the domestic animal in almost all cases knows what's coming. I have been there. I have seen it. And so, and I have done it. Even as children, as boys, and as families, we had a few sheep and a few animals that we killed ourselves. They always know. But quite often, that wild animal doesn't know at all. And quite often, when they do know, they evade us, which is also fantastic.
Yeah.
But we can have a situation where we can procure a living creature that has lived its life in nature to the fullest, which emblemizes the beauty of the natural world and incentivizes us to care for them, to want to work on their behalf. And then we can harvest them in a very quick, and not that there isn't pain, but a relatively humane way,
Yeah.
and bring them back as food and with all the other experiences that go along with it. So I actually believe that there's a very strong animal welfare element to the issue of hunting, which has been missed or certainly has not been emphasized by most commentators and most hunters themselves.
Mm-hmm.
In part, I think, because the hunting community fears that if we talk about this, that people will immediately come back and say, "Well, you're a hunter. I mean, how can you be talking about animal welfare, Randy? You kill things, and they're right.
Yeah.
And people are reluctant. But I think if we think about the issue being how they live,
Yeah.
then I really do believe that this activity, and I believe this wild harvesting, particularly for terrestrial wildlife and other foods that we take from the land, not only is it sustainable, but I think it is highly humane. By the way, sorry, I come from an industrial fishing culture, but it's certainly far more humane than most fishing practices.
Yeah.
And people mightn't care as much about how a codfish feels when it comes up from the bottom at rapid pace up to the top, and it sort of has the experience that it does physiologically. But let there be no question that the animal experiences pain and discomfort.
Yeah.
I really think, and I really do believe, that hunting, sensitively done, appropriately done, well done, is for meat procurement absolutely one of the most humane and animal welfare-oriented activities that we have.
Yeah. Well, I like your point of emphasis that we should focus how the animal lives.
Yep.
And do all we can about how it dies.
Yep.
But it's how it lives that
is
very important.
True of us too,
Yeah, I am. You will hear, if my wife was here, she would say, Randy's dream death would be to end up as recycled bear dung.
Yeah.
That's a part of the natural landscape. Now, I don't. I
hope you're not off in your sleep before he comes to visit.
Shane, we've talked about a lot of pieces here in this introductory part. I want to make sure people know how they can learn of your work and the Wild Harvest Initiative. Where and on what?
It's fairly easy because, first of all, they can just look for me and they'll find me without too much trouble, but they can either visit the conservationvisions.com website, or they can visit the wildharvestinitiative.com website, and they're both being revised at the present time. And I'm sure we'll get into this in subsequent episodes here of what the plans are for exporting the information, but we have a pretty elaborate piece of machinery being developed there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have a very large Facebook following.
Yes, there's lots of people out there who are very kind. I like to joke sometimes, but maybe their lives are not that interesting if they follow me. But I am very grateful for.
And rumor has it that you have started a YouTube channel also with some of your content. Is that true?
Well, yes, we have, and we're hoping to get a lot more aggressive with that. As you know, Randy, I do a lot of things in the international policy space with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, International Council for Wildlife, as well as run Conservation Visions itself. So it's quite challenging to keep all these spaces and efforts going, particularly when a lot of my work involves reviewing very massive documents surrounding sustainable use and working with the Convention on Biodiversity and so forth. But I really would like to, and we are hoping now to move much more aggressively into that YouTube platform business. We've produced lots of things, but it needs to be coordinated, and you've done a masterful job, obviously, at doing those kinds of things with what you do. So hopefully you can give us some tips on that.
Yeah, my goal is that all of your knowledge and work can be brought through these communication platforms.
Yeah.
To give people these understandings, the context, the opportunities that exist, and see the value it provides.
Yeah.
And you're doing the hard work. The easy part will be distilling it and distributing it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And that'll be your job. So that's good.
Well, I'll have full employment then, Shane.
Yeah, you will. You will. Yeah, I guess so.
So, Shane, given where we are at right now, why the program of Wild Harvest Initiative? Why do you feel it's so critical at this time?
I think we're entering a really dynamic time over the debates of the future of the planet, the future of humanity, and a way to find ourselves back in a circumstance where both can be sustainable for the long-term future. I believe that one of the basic aspects of human ecology that is simply unavoidable, it is impossible to reinvent it, is our basic reliance on the natural systems of this planet. Fresh air, clean water, land to grow things or to harvest things from. And I believe that any attempts to deny our natural ecology are simply doomed essentially to failure. Our reliance on the wild oceans and our reliance on the wild lands, whether we are talking about indigenous cultures in various parts of the world or we're talking non-indigenous cultures, that's a reality. I wanted to find a way from a North American perspective to bring real evidence to this debate and to show that we are effectively operating under a system that is encouraging this natural ecology and which has proven of enormous benefit to people and to wildlife and to the conservation of the natural systems we have here. And that in microcosm for North America is really the holy grail, as I've said, of this wider global debate over the future of humanity and the future of the planet. And so I think Wild Harvest Initiative is really able to make an extremely significant contribution to that. And I think, speaking somewhat more locally and restrictively, I think the future of all hunting in North America and in other parts of the world, with the exception of subsistence hunting by indigenous peoples, but all other hunting in everywhere else in the world will ultimately depend on this aspect of food and food as a motivation for the activity. Because remember, the critics of hunting are fundamentally engaged in focusing on what is the motivation of the individual doing it. It's not necessarily on what happens to the animal at the end of the day. So I think for those reasons, this is required, and I believe it is, and I know it is a totally unique effort. It has never been attempted before. It's a very large-scale piece of work. It involves dealing with 50 to 60 government agencies on a regular basis, all of which are proving very, very helpful to us. But it is no small lift. And unless you had real familiarity with synthetic work, which is what I have done a lot of in my lifetime, bringing pieces together and fitting them into a whole, I think it would seem to be simply overwhelming for people. But we are making it happen, and it is critical for those reasons.
Yeah. So Shane, you just talked about taking a whole lot of information and synthesizing it into something that people can use for policy, for their bigger understanding. Your whole initiative seems like it's a science endeavor. Mm-hmm. You're a scientist, or you are schooled in this and trained in this and spent your life doing it. So the Wild Harvest Initiative, tell me how this science-based part of this is coming together.
Well, I think what you have to understand first is that, to make a difference in conservation policy, you have to have a knowledge base for making those decisions. A lot of times we refer to that science base as science because it involves certain ways of doing things. And there is a lot of science involved in this particular effort. First of all, the data that has been gathered by state and provincial agencies on a regular basis in a predictable format, and stored and made accessible in ways that one can look longitudinally, as we say, across time, looking at the information, but where you can look at the harvest of a wide range of various species, and the data is recorded in the same way, by age and by sex and by number, and all of these kinds of things. The very basis of the effort has a kind of a scientific or data-driven potential and possibility that I did not create. That's created in the broader North American sense, and each individual state agency and province, gathers the data that way, which is what I did when I led the research programs in Newfoundland. But we take this data, of course, and bring it into something that's synthetic. We will not be talking about a particular species. We will not in a particular region like elk in Montana. Right. We will be talking about all harvested wildlife species, including those trapped, by the way, in Canada and the United States. And then, of course, we just don't take that data. We want to determine, okay, when we harvest this many elk or this many moose or this many waterfowl or whatever it might be, what does that really look like in terms of the amount of food? Well, what we had to do to do that, and we had to be consistent, we had to find sources of information that could give us reasonable estimates on the body size, for example, of the various species in question. Now, as you know, the size of species varies across the range. The Shiras moose here is not the big guy that lives in the Yukon and parts of Alaska, and Newfoundland moose look somewhat different. We have to go into that literature, gather that kind of information, and say, okay, we are going to choose this particular citation as our basic, size for that particular species. So we have harvested that kind of information from a very large array of scientific sources, and we choose absolutely the most credible of them. And then in our database, which is massive, we've built an extraordinary database. Then with each weight, of course, we have a citation associated with that. So 50 years from now, someone could say, well, what did they use for the body weight of moose? Well, there it is. Then we do the same thing in looking for, okay, what is the dressed weight or the eviscerated weight of this animal? Because we know you lose, some 40 to 50% of the animal goes out in that, in the hide and the hocks and the rumen and so forth. And so we find the best estimate of that, again, for every single species, every duck, every deer. And then we look at that and we say, well, okay, this is what we might call the consumable biomass for this particular harvest. And of course, you have to remember, in many cases, we have males and females identified in the harvest as well for deer species, and so we've got to go through that process for that. And then what we do is we break down that amount of meat by either 6 or 9 ounce servings to say, well, on average, if somebody was to have a share of meat on their plate, this is what they would have. And then so for every species, we go through that process. So in the database, all these columns are there, and you go across from the species and you see it, and it ultimately ends up, these are the number of meals that are provided by all elk hunters in Canada and the United States in, year 1, year 2, year 3. And but we can also, of course, parse that data. We can just say, well, how many meals are there in Montana? How many meals are there in New Mexico with elk or whatever it might be? We can do all of that. And then in addition to that, we have in that database, we have values on, what replacement cost, as we call them, might be for that. This comes back to this idea of, if you bought pork instead of having your elk, what would you pay for it if you bought beef, and so on and so forth. And all of this is one of the important things about science. I mean, science is simply a way of seeing the world, but it has predictable practices, and it has consistency, and it has citations of work that is reliable, that one can say, okay, that's accurate, that's fair, that's what a black bear weighs, and that's reasonable. And of course, it needs to be repeatable, so people need to see that data so that if they ever want to do it, they can either challenge you and say, you use the wrong things, or actually there's something new out there now that you probably should have been using, which is how the evolving nature of science works. And so we started out by also doing something that I love to do. I'm very big on experiments. Experiments in the workplace, experiments on how to gather data, experiments on even on our social media, as you know, we've been experimental and a little bit chaotic, it may appear, but we have 1 million people on Facebook who are trotting around, so we've had some successes there. But one of the experiments we ran here, we went after 2 years of information first, 14, 15, 15, 16, those hunting seasons. Again, for all states and provinces, all species. And so what we have to do there is we glean the information we can from any online published data that's available. That can come from a variety of sources. But what we do then, of course, and this is another thing about science, you have to verify that. You can't just assume that that's absolutely the best data, that's absolutely up to speed. All kinds of things happen in agencies. People retire, people take time off from work for one thing or another. The data slips a little bit. Having worked in those systems for a long period of time, I know how that works. We go back to the agencies with verification forms. We make personal contacts with them. By that I mean by phone and by email. And we show them the forms and we say, now, for your state in Montana, let's say, these are the records that we have. And we will ask you to please check these records for us if you would. And if they're fine, just tick the box and move on. If there are missing records, then you go to another part of our little survey and you give us that new information. We go back then and add that to our database, of course. And then we know with those first 2 years, I use them as an experiment. We manipulated how the database should look. If we wanted to extract information, what's the best way to do it? What's the architecture of that database look like? We've hired a firm. They're a very well-known firm, and they built the database for us. We populate that database and extract from it. So then with that, of course, we have now worked out the bugs, and so now we are adding the data from 2017, to 2021. So and the reason for that is, before we start to publish this information and bring it out in a major way to the public, we needed to have enough data for enough years to show it's not a fluke, it's not something peculiar went on here. We will ultimately want to have much longer data sets. And then, of course, with the surveys, the shearing surveys, we also ran an experiment. We did the first one in Texas and worked out bugs there, and now we've run them in Arizona, Nevada, Wyoming, and we just finished one in Alaska, and we have others that we plan. So the scientific nature of this is to show that, number one, our work is valid, it is transparent, it can be verified, it can be duplicated, and also, of course, it can find its way into the peer-reviewed literature as published science. And then potentially, I'm thinking of a book on wild harvesting in America as a way of, bringing this information forward. But we also want heavy reliance on the popular media. One of the things I've done, I'm cited a lot for my caribou work and my moose work and my bear work and my predator-prey work in academic spaces. But I have always spent more time than most people who had my kind of job speaking directly with hunting organizations. That's true. And non-hunting organizations, too. I dealt with Sierra Club a lot, and I speak to people in IFAW and other places. So I have that dialogue, but I like to deal with people on the ground, so I want this scientific information to also be accessible to the non-scientist, of course. So that's where we're experimenting with our short films and obviously with our social media platforms and with the lectures that I give. But it has to be based in science. First of all, as you know, the North American model itself states that the basis of our decision-making will be
science-based.
So with this being so intimately connected, that needs to be the case.
Yeah.
And it will stand the test of time. I'm entirely confident about the data that when we release this data, and people are going to be absolutely shocked by the scale of what we're harvesting. It's it's incredible. It really
you've
is.
opened a few pages for me to look at, and that's a part of the genesis of why I said, Shane, we have to have these discussions, because just the little bits I was reading, I'm like, this is going to change the way that not just those of us who are wild harvesters, but those who maybe aren't, whether they're a beneficiary of the harvest or just disconnected from it.
Yeah.
It's going to change a lot of things. And so
It will.
seeing the way that you're approaching it,
Yeah.
I'm glad you're giving it the diligence and the effort to make sure it will stand up to.
Well, it has to be
do it.
because, we have so much information out there on other aspects of things that, frankly, this is another big project we're about to start. But, you even take something like hunter participation or expenditures by hunters or things of this nature. You can find a lot of different statistics out there because it was done in one way. I'm sure you've run into this many times in your own work. And we need these standards that are out there that people can say, okay, if I'm going to bring information to the IUCN, to the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, and I'm going to use the North American model as a success story for conservation based on sustainable use of wildlife, I cannot go to an organization that has 15,000 scientists and give them something that's written on the back of a napkin. You have to give them what, right? You have to give them what's in their own religion, and their religion is this religion of science, and that it has great strengths. And so we are being very, very, very cautious about how we do our surveys and how we get our responses and how we test, statistically our work and so on and so forth. So it's very much, very, very heavily science-based.
So doing all this work, you must have some strategic objectives about what are the things I'm trying to accomplish along the way and the boxes I want to check as part of your strategy?
Well, the first thing is I want to be able to explain that not only is it possible in a modern world and in a very modern nation, two very modern nations, for there to be a meaningful place for the harvest of living wild resources that are undertaken by the individual. In other words, we don't go to the store and buy them because somebody else provided them for us. That it is possible to continue with this tradition of having people do that and who become incentivized champions for wildlife. Wildlife, as Roosevelt said, and many have said since his time, cannot speak for themselves, and that's one thing that human beings can do that can help meaningfully. And we've proven that over time, that we are able to do that. That is a very clear objective of mine. Thirdly, I don't like the way we treat the earth. I think we can do a lot better job. And I look at rural societies. I look at the society that I grew up in, for example, and, to this very day, the vast majority of the island of Newfoundland and Labrador on the mainland part of the province, they're like they were. That's because we had few people. It wasn't because we were saints. We would have done all the rest of the stuff. We just didn't have it. But yet we know what low-impact human environments look like versus high-impact human environments. We have a lot of human apes, crawling around this planet right now. We've got to figure out something to make it work. And I think we have a responsibility in North America to help show how it can work. We're wealthy. We are free. We have invested incredibly in science. We have vast reservoirs of knowledge. And so my objective also is to release that and to hopefully invoke a sense of responsibility in North Americans that we need to do that. I want to also demonstrate to people that there are alternatives to feeding people, and that in my personal view, if we were to apply the science we have in terms of how we can manage the environment, we could actually produce far more, and I mean far more, wildlife and far more wild food from the landscapes that we have. And a major objective of mine is this, is I want to change this policy of looking at landscapes as places where you make modest trade-offs, but you never, whatever else you never consider their food production capacity. We do that for agricultural land.
Oh, yeah.
It's highly unlikely with a good piece of agricultural land somebody's going to get a permit to go in and put in a ski resort in the middle of it. But if you take a piece of wild land, it's highly likely they will get it if they can prove that the economics work.
Right.
I want all that land to be looked at as we traditionally, indigenously, looked at the land, which was fundamentally as a place in which to live, to find security, to find food, to find shelter. And that doesn't mean I think we all got to go back to living, in a hide hut or something of this nature, although there mightn't be all that much wrong with that. But I do feel that we can just do a much better job. And, do you know that some of your national forests in your country focuses very much on, the production of wild berries, that there are actually, national forests that have that as a major focus of their work. And that in parts of Alaska, some of the forests there, the tremendous involvement with indigenous fisheries and so on and so forth. In other words, we already have some little things working this way. I want to bring it to a continental scale and show, let's have a transformation here. And then I also intend to bring this into the One Health debate. What's good for wildlife, Randy, is good for you. What's good for you is good for them. And I want people to be aware of that. I'm hoping to demonstrate it through this food issue. So those are some of the main objectives that I have. They're pretty big.
Yeah, but, the world is seldom changed by small thinkers. So.
We're going to do our best here with regard to that. There's no question.
You think about the deliverables that
Yep.
you'll bring from this program of the
Yep.
Wild Harvest Initiative. Any deliverables that come to mind, or any absolute fundamentals? I mean, like knowledge-based.
And first and foremost, obviously, we're going to bring forward just this sheer amount of meat that is being harvested. I mean, just the statistic of the biomass, and then the economic value of this, of what it's contributing to our countries, to our communities, to our family food economies, and so on, at a time when 1 in 6 people in the United States of America suffer some kind of food insecurity. I mean, I want this to be demonstrated, and I want people to stop thinking about this activity of wild harvesting as kind of like a pet project. This is big business, and we ought to start recognizing and treating it as big business, and figuring out how we can make it even into an even bigger business. So I think that's one knowledge product that we want. The second knowledge product I want to bring forward is how these activities lean us into actually building better communities and better societies. The fact that people go out and sometimes are gone for a week and they come back with an elk or a mule deer or a caribou in Newfoundland or a moose or whatever, and they come back and may give some of that animal to 20 or 25 people, some in their homes, their sons, their daughters, their husbands, their wives, whatever, but a lot to other people and to colleagues at work and so on and so forth. Even that is giving those people some connection to the natural world. Hey, that's amazing. Yeah, my neighbor, Randy, he actually goes out and hunts elk and comes back with an animal. The meat is beautiful. Well, if you've never been part of that culture, you don't think about any of that. You don't think about landscapes like that. You drive your car along the road. You don't think, well, geez, those elk out there, they're actually feeding out there. And then when they feed and become healthy, someone harvests them and we feed and become healthy. I very much want to see, that kind of identity of the hunter as provider. And some people will listen to this and say, well, that's just corny, that's just cliche kind of stuff. No, it's not. This is actually the truth of the matter, and it has always been the truth of the matter. And the amazing thing is that I can find statistics in the Wild Harvest Initiative to prove everybody knows hunters share. Every hunter knows I give some meat to so-and-so.
Yeah,
so
we all do it.
We will show the scale to which that is absolutely happening with verifiable information and data that I would like to see done in every state and every province in the two countries. And I think by doing so, it's only going to reinforce the support in the minds of the American public and the Canadian public that this is a good thing, this is an honorable thing. They've already said, as long as you are going to harvest these animals and you're going to use them for food, we are going to be behind you The vast, vast majority. I only have to ask you, how many political, socio-political identities in your country get 70 to 80% support? I bet you there's not many of those right now. So,
I've got 5 fingers here. I don't think I'd need them all.
yeah, exactly. But we do have that. But this is going to reinforce that.
Yeah.
This is going to reinforce that because not only are we harvesting for food, we're harvesting and we're sharing them. And as I've said, sharing is something that people strongly, strongly believe in human beings. They love human beings who share.
Yeah. So Shane, this is a very ambitious project. You've been working on it for a long time. I just admire how much you've put into it. Is there anything similar, any path you've been able to follow and say, oh, that's how they did this? I have a little bit to learn from here. Is this just kind of like going out into the wildness of science and data and trying to bring forth some answers?
In the temperate world, there is absolutely nothing to compare with it in terms of scale or, scale of effort or the values of the outcomes that will come from it. There is nothing. There was never anything done in Canada or the United States of this kind at all. So it's completely novel in our space. But this data is now serving as supplementary information, as it's called, to the Convention on Biodiversity on Wild Meat Harvesting already. It's already been brought into that, which is a major, major achievement. There have been strong efforts made to look at sectoral areas with respect to wild meat harvesting in tropical and subtropical regions in the Congo and Amazon basin, for example. But they've been largely motivated by trying to measure the offtake of wild meat under circumstances where people are motivated to harvest because they absolutely need the food as indigenous people or non-indigenous people, and where sometimes, and sometimes frequently, the offtakes are excessive because the people must eat. They rely on it. They have to. So the effort by world organizations was to try to investigate that as a way to find up with how to make bushmeat, as it was called, more sustainable so that people could still have access to the food, but of course not eliminate the wildlife. Now, is this not essentially the same principles on which we built the North American model? Mm-hmm. So this is where we have that contribution to make. But the answer to your question is, Randy, no, I couldn't go anywhere and find this. When I first came up with this idea, I searched myself and, because I thought it had to have been done at some scale somewhere, and it wasn't. And then I, worked with another person to actually dig deeper to make sure before I talked to partners and so on and so forth that this was going to be new. No, you're looking at, you're looking at a bit of a sphinx. It's a fairly unique kind of thing, but it is rising up from our history because without us having been tracking that information, right, Randy, we couldn't do anything.
We don't have it.
Yeah.
So, as you're doing this and you're collaborating with so many scientists, is this information, your processes, the way you're going about this, is this contributing to other efforts in the scientific community?
Well, I think the fact that, we've already at these early stages been able to bring, we provided a major report to the Convention on Biodiversity, and when they were saying we want more studies done examining the harvest of wild meat, their language in the convention was exclusively about tropical and subtropical areas.
Okay.
I was engaged and am engaged heavily in the convention process through my work with IUCN. And, through a series of meetings and discussions, we got them to broaden that language to include other areas, non-tropical and non-subtropical areas. But we were the only entity to be able to bring something forward in spaces other than that. And of course, we were the only ones who were primarily bringing information on what we call recreational harvest. In other words, it wasn't absolute subsistence harvesting. So, we're already involved with a number of people, including CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, and FAO, the Federation of Agricultural Organizations, who are keenly aware of our work, and we discuss and talk about things all the time. As a matter of fact, one of their scientists, Julia Faw, has been a reviewer on one of our big fish papers that's coming out, because we're also doing a lot of stuff on fishing. But so yes, we are making those connections, We will be publishing this work, which is going to change that. We may do some collaborative book writing, comparing tropical and subtropical and temperate systems and so on. But and the IUCN, of course, is one of the partners. So in that sense, we're linking with a lot of people as well already.
Yeah. So if I'm a wild harvester, what are the takeaways that you want me to know about how this program, how the Wild Harvest Initiative is something I, as a wild harvester, should be aware of, and how it is important to me?
Well, I think what this program is doing is representing you in a way as a wild harvester in a way that nothing else has. And I don't just mean as hunters, because, you know, the fungi or mushroom harvesters and the berry harvesters and the recreational fishers and all of that, you know, we intend to build all that. And now that we have the U.S. Forest Service as a partner just recently, we got some great ideas on a big expanse to think about doing that on their lands. So first of all, I would say to the individual harvester, you know, somewhere in that massive database, whatever information you have ever provided, whether you live in Georgia, whether you live in British Columbia, whether you live in Montana or West Virginia, it doesn't make any difference. It's in there. You are in there. One of those records, it came from Mr. Smith at 10 Stony Lane in Livingston, Montana, or whatever it might be. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you really are concerned as a harvester about the future of this culture and whether you can pass it on to your children and whether they can pass it on to their children, then we have to find something that is obviously different than whatever we have been working on to this point in time, because whatever we have tried to do up to this point in time, no matter how good the effort was, we are seeing the same kind of trends. Yeah. They're a little bit slower, but they're still there. A little bit of blip with COVID, but overall the line looks like this. We have to do something dramatically very soon, or that demographic problem in our hunting where we have so many old hunters, older age hunters, that is going to just be almost an insurmountable problem. This is identified to appeal to young people living in cities, young people living in rural places, young people who, you know, want a better world, who are concerned about climate change, who have different ideas than their parents, and so on and so forth, who are fascinated with their own health, even though they're at the healthiest stage of their life. I mean, I don't know what happened there, but anyway, that's the truth of the matter. So I want them to see themselves in this, because I want those opportunities to be there. And it's not a matter, Randy, either of how big that community of harvesters is. It's how relevant and how vibrant that community of harvesters is. And I'm not saying that through this we're going to go up to 10% of people engaged in recreational hunting or something like that, but we can bring more young people into this with different views of how the earth is supposed to be treated, with different views about what humanity's roles and responsibilities are. And I think you can already see that this kind of foraging appeals to people. I mean, the number of people who have become vegan, who have, you know, I mean, it's almost a sub-phenomenon now in veganism that there are people who have chosen to become vegan, but will make the exception for wild meats. We all know people like this. Yeah. And so, you know, this is just a demonstration for them that I really am fighting for the future of this. And in that sense, I suppose I'm fighting for each one of them. And the third thing that I would say to the wild harvester is, I am assuming that you care deeply about wildlife, like most wild harvesters do. Yep. You know, blueberry pickers miss it when the blueberry crop is no good, or it's a poor year, or somebody tears up the landscape. If you're not a blueberry picker, you don't really care what happens to the blueberry bushes. It's the same way with wildlife. And so I would say to them, you care? This is a way for us to demonstrate another incredible value of wildlife, which was its basic value in one sense to us historically and evolutionarily. We hunted them for food. And those wild animals that require those healthy wild spaces are there to support us as food security proponents, or aspects of our food security and of a healthy environment. And that this data is going to demonstrate that to people all the way from the White House, hopefully, right down to the local municipal manager who's developing policies about how we handle land or access or anything of that nature.
Yeah. Well, Shane, that puts a pretty big bow on explaining some of the aspects of what Wild Harvest Initiative is about, why someone like me, who is a wild harvester, why this is very important to where I see this going. Where, like all of us, I think when any activity gives us as much benefit, as much pleasure, satisfaction, whatever term you want to use, we want to see that continue. We don't want, the old saying of "not on my watch." And part of my fascination with the work that you and all your colleagues are doing at the Wild Harvest Initiative is I see this as the opportunity to explain what wild harvest really is in whatever facet of it that you take into. So I'm excited to talk more about what you're doing, where you're going, what outcomes you hope to have. So
ultimately, health is about finding the animal in ourselves, Randy. It's something the medical profession needs to understand a lot better too. That's ultimately what health is.
Yeah.
And it's when we vary consistently and forever away from that, and that takes many forms: not spending time in nature, not tasting wild natural foods, not experiencing the drama that takes place in the natural world, not caring for it. When we step too far away from our animal nature, that is really the first sign that we are headed towards health impairment. I firmly believe that. I always have. And I think the Wild Harvest Initiative is a reminder that keeping alive the animal within us and allowing it to express itself is actually one way towards a healthier person and healthier communities and a healthier world.
Yeah. Well, Shane, I don't think it'd be fair to talk about the Wild Harvest Initiative without the Alliance and your partners that are involved. Who and what role do they play?
Well, from the very outset, what I wanted to do with this effort was to prove that the basic premise that food could attract a wide variety of perspectives and reach a wide variety of people. I set out to create an alliance of partners that was unusual, because I figured that that would be a demonstration in and of itself that when we took this on the road, so to speak, to legislators and people in the public, we could then expect the same kind of diverse response. And so we have this quite unique assembly of organizations, institutions, and individuals who are now in support of the Wild Harvest Initiative. And that includes organizations that are associated with the outdoor industry, such as Leupold and Sitka, Mystery Ranch, etc. And it also includes, however, state governments. So we have had the state government in Florida and Texas, Nevada, Arizona, Wyoming, and Alaska, all involved. And when I say the state government, of course, I mean the state agency, but nevertheless the support and so on to the program is provided obviously by the state government through their agency. And the third main category of organizations are the sort of the NGOs in the hunting world, the Wild Sheep Foundations, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundations, the Dallas Safari Clubs, the SCIs, etc., backcountry hunters and anglers. There's quite a variety, and in some cases this involves the head office, so to speak, the parent organization, and in some cases it involves some of their chapters. And that was that sort of assembly of government, industry, and NGO. That's not a really common set of mixtures to be able to bring into things, as you very well know.
Yeah.
That has been expanded further recently in that we have now signed an agreement with the U.S. Forest Service to become involved in the Wild Harvest Initiative, and we have a lot of plans there that are very unique to that bilateral partnership. But that, of course, brings in our first federal agencies.
Right.
So now we have state agencies and federal agencies, and we have more business interests coming in at the present time. Wildlife Systems in Texas has just joined a short while ago. And, we have the National Wildlife Federations and, just a really wide variety of supporters. And many of these organizations have been supporting, for a number of years. They've been very, very steady. incredibly important partners, not only because of the wherewithal they bring financially, but because the networks they bring, the influence space that they bring. You know, take Rocky Mountain elk, for example. You know, they have this amazing space around an iconic animal in the American West, but also somewhat to the east and central, and in Canada as well. And they have a massive focus, for example, on land, on habitat,
right.
which really, you don't just have the partner as a partner who helps support it. You have a partner who is interested in the idea. And all of these partners, of course, have an interest in conservation. They all also have an interest in the future of hunting. And where is all this headed? Because whether they're in industry or in state government or in federal agencies or in NGOs that were built in support of wildlife conservation, they all recognize that much of the juice that comes to them to do their work actually arises from the hunting community in one way or another. But the alliance itself was deliberately set up in a way. My first approaches to people were to encourage them to see this as something unique by virtue of it being something that was foundational. Nobody needed to get their nose out of joint about something that was talking about wild food because, it seemed a pretty common denominator for all human beings. And it was becoming obvious to most of the players in the space anyway that, this was something whose time really had come. And, I was not the only one, obviously, aware of the health movements and all these kinds of things. And, we've continued to expand that partnership over time. It hasn't decreased, it has increased. And just in the past month and a half, we've added 3 new partners to it. We also have 1 or 2 private philanthropists who have provided support to this. And that's very interesting. And we are now very close to a very significant partnership with an international organization that has primarily interest in the conservation of African wildlife. But they are very interested in how we were able to build this alliance and this program in North America. And they're very interested now in seeing if it would be possible to bring this approach to the southern African region, probably South Africa itself or to Namibia.
Wow.
And they're also interested in building an alliance with us on a different front. I've explained to the people who operate in the African space, of course, that if you are interested in maintaining international hunting in that part of the world, you have to realize that the vast majority of all the people who go there to participate in international hunting are, in fact, Americans.
Yeah.
Those Americans represent a tiny, tiny percentage of the overall hunting community in the United States, but they were born out of the same set of principles and ideas and training and concepts and philosophies as everybody else. And that, therefore, if you really want to understand the future, for example, of international hunting and community-based resource management in African regions that is dependent upon foreign clients coming, spending money, and so forth, then you really ought to be gaining a much, much better understanding of the North American system itself, of the North American model, and of the United States of America and its hunting culture in particular. And they immediately saw the sense in this from their perspective. So if they do become a partner, and I suspect we will know this fall, certainly before Christmas, whether this is going to fly or not, it's a big partnership, so there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of commitments that Conservation Visions has to make. But if they do become a partner in this, then I'll be introducing them to the network of other partners here in North America. And I will also be launching a wild harvest initiative, we might call it a chapter or a project, in somewhere in the southern African region. And that, of course, will bring in a whole new set of dimensions, because what a lot of people don't know, of course, is many of those international hunters who maybe hunt buffalo or other species like that, when the animal is killed, they obviously do not bring their meat home. It's to it's too onerous an expensive a proposition. But that doesn't mean that the meat is wasted. The meat is given to the local rural communities and families there for their consumption. And so wild meat is still beginning to play ever more a role in those models also, another example of its expansionist capacity, I guess. So it's been very unique, and I'm hoping it will continue. And of course, the more diversity we have, then the more angles to the story we are able to tell, and we are encouraged to tell.
Yeah.
And the partners, of course, in the alliance, they have a lot of motivations for joining, and there's a lot of benefits ultimately that will come to them from joining.
Which gets me to the question: if you and I were floating down the river and you were trying to convince me to be an alliance partner, my first question would be, well, why? What's in it for me? What are the benefits of being an alliance partner?
And I think that's a totally reasonable question. And of course, the reason the question is asked will depend on who the potential new partner is.
Right.
The state agency will ask the same question, but looking for a different answer in a way than the non-governmental organization might, or the private philanthropist, or whoever it might be. They'll all have the question, but it will all be asked from a slightly different perspective. My first response to all of that is first of all, I want to be very clear that part of what you're supporting is something that's a lot bigger than yourselves.
Right.
And if that part of it doesn't really motivate you at all, then we probably should just break out the rods and keep
fishing.
casting. Yeah, keep fishing. Because there has to be, some element of wanting to do good for wildlife in general, and wanting to do good for this culture in general. And if at least part of your motivation is not that, I think I find it very difficult that you will find your right space here.
Yeah.
But given that I think most, and obviously the players that we have here engaged in this, they do have that as a motivation. And some of the very early players, like Dallas Safari Club, for example, was a very early major sponsor of this. It jumped in instantly. Wild sheep came in extremely fast, and elk came in really fast. And these were important. They were high profile, and they were important players, and so forth. They all had strong elements of this, of wanting to support conservation. But they also recognize, of course, as do the state agencies, that the future of hunting directly impacts them, so that anything that is capable of encouraging, maintaining, resourcing the kind of hunting culture and nurturing it and providing it with a sense of identity and a sense of legitimacy and a sense of pride is going to be in the long term in their best interest in a variety of ways. Sometimes, however, there are much more specific benefits, and they are different, as I said, depending on who's answering the question. The private philanthropist, we have a gentleman from Florida who invested significantly in this and doesn't want any profile, but he's just deeply interested in maintaining natural landscapes in the part of Florida where he comes from, and he believes that part of the way to do that is to maintain wildlife and to maintain hunting on those landscapes. And so he has a sort of a personal interest that way. For the state agencies, of course, not only is the data extraordinarily valuable to them. I mean, up until the time I've launched this, no state agency could tell anyone in their community, hunter or non-hunter alike, actually how much wild food was coming off the lands they were managing. Now, that seems a remarkable statement, but I'm not being critical. It's just a statement of
what it was.
Of what it was. Now they will not only have that, they will have it by species, and they'll have it by year, and not only that, they will be able to compare it with landscapes or political jurisdictions, i.e. other states that are adjacent or far away or have tried different things or have different cultural aspects to how they conduct this activity in their particular region. And they will see themselves as part, of course, of of a mosaic of both Canadian and American entities. So, that will provide refraction on exactly how the two main partners in the North American model may be moving in different kinds of ways, what matters most to people in those places. They'll also, in answering, the challenges that they often face as state agencies, where people say, where do you put your money and why do you put your money there and why do you support this aspect of your program, et cetera. We long have pointed out, of course, that many programs are funded with dollars that arise from sustainable use activities. Not all of it goes into game species. All of our non-game programs were started with the same base budgets, for example, much of which was provided by the hunting community. And that's fine, too. That's the way it should be. But they also now have a chance to talk about what their total harvests are. How many species of waterfowl do they hunt, and how many of those are hunted in every particular year. And then they also get to have an opportunity to say what that wild food means in the context of their personal statistics on things like food insecurity, because every state is different.
Right.
Some states have much higher rates, some states have lower rates, and so on and so forth, and what the possibilities are for expanding it. Against some of the criticisms they take for being in support of hunting, when they are able to talk about this amount of wild food that they have, I think that's another advantage. It's an argument that they never had before, that they couldn't really talk about except in generalities. They'll be able to talk about it in high specifics as a result of this. And of course, then there are the hunting, the meat sharing surveys themselves. They're also, for the first time, going to be able to say things like, well, we know that in our state, we have whatever, X number of hunters. But we know that 85% of them share the harvest that they take, and that they give that harvest or share that harvest on average with 5 or 10 or 15 people additional to themselves. And I think this is a way of showing that the government programs are in support of something that has kind of social reaction associated with it. It has social reach that goes beyond the particular group that is often targeted as being prominent, the hunter themselves, when in fact the benefits of the activity actually extend much wider amongst the citizenry. These are all, in my view, first of all, they're all brand new. We never had any of them before. So it's really a major achievement in that respect. And secondly, again, as I said in earlier parts of this program, Randy, it's fitting in with the very social movements that the elected officials and policy directors in those regions are dealing with, the issues of health and security and longevity and good food and healthy food and what diets should be like and so on and so forth. So it's also providing them with it allows them to be current in the debate that's going on, instead of simply reacting to something as though, well, this is something we really don't know anything about.
Yeah. Well,
now they do know something about it, and I think that's another one of the benefits. From the industry side of things, the loopholes and the mystery ranches and the Sitkas, et cetera, these groups really obviously provide commodities into not only the hunting space, but the outdoor space generally. It is in their interest to be associated with things that are good, and even if they are proud of being associated with hunting, which most, if not all of them are, now they have another story that they too can tell, that they too can put on their website. Of benefits that come from people appropriately and legally using what they produce, whether it's a hunting rifle or whether it's a scope or whether it's a set of binoculars or whatever it might be. And the other thing I think that's a benefit to the industry players is that we are not only talking about hunting, because we want to move into this wild foraging in general, as we talked about earlier, the berries and the mushrooms and all these kinds of things. Well, everybody who goes in those spaces still wants, good hiking boots and water repellent, rain gear or whatever it might be. And so I think it's also, in my view, when I talk to the industry about it, think of the imagery that you are now able to focus on that you might not have thought about focusing on before, all under this umbrella of food. You can imagine the image of the hunter standing on at sundown, with the binoculars in hand, sort of looking out. Obviously, that person is going hunting. But you can also have these beautiful pictures, as I said, of these little humans sitting down. They're, babies essentially, being able to sit down in front of a basket in a forest, glade of dappled light where they're harvesting, these mushrooms and putting them in the baskets. That can also be part of what these industries are able to market. And one of my ultimate goals with the Wild Harvest is I'm going to get at this issue of beauty. Because I believe that ultimately the most important thing that any of us harvest when we're out in the wilds, and this is a unifying principle for hunter and non-hunter alike, is we are harvesting beauty. And we take those memories back, and it is about the animals that we've seen, the snow on the mountain ridges that we've witnessed, the steam coming out of the elk's nostrils in the early morning in a high alpine meadow. I mean, these are, fish jumping up in a stream. I mean,
absolutely.
So when I think of people like optics companies in particular, I can already think of the advertisements that I would create. Yeah. We're in the business of a lot of harvests, and the last one would simply be beauty. Yeah. Meat, whatever, and the last one would actually be beauty, and maybe there'd be a beautiful songbird in that image or whatever it might be. So I think these are the advantages. And then, of course, there is the network itself. When you start to bring together state directors, highly placed officials in federal agencies, the leadership of the NGO community, and I've named off some of them. Right, I'm sure I may have missed a few, and I'm sorry about that, but there are a lot of them. And you start bringing them together, as we regularly do in dialogue with our phone conversations and our meetings. And now you start talking about potentially bringing in European-based interests to talk about the bridge between North America and African hunting. Now all of a sudden you have got a channel of communication around a forceful conservation agency, wild food and wild harvesting, that simply did not exist before I put that together. Yes, there were partnerships. Of course, I realize that. But these partnerships are focused around a new way of seeing landscapes, a new way of seeing conservation. It is new. Believe me, I know this business really well. And this is new. This has not been attempted before. And once we have it set up and running, what I want to do is establish it as an ongoing database, and ultimately someone else will actually do this. And every year, all of this food-related harvesting will be recorded. So we'll have, longitudinal data to be able to make comparisons over time. Did we do better? Did we do worse? Did changing habitat situations diminish our opportunities to gather this wild food? Did changes in climate and weather affect our capacities to do this? Did species gills change and affect our abilities to harvest wild food? Did society change so much that all of a sudden they didn't want to harvest wild food, or they wanted to harvest more, whatever it might be? So I think there's a lot to answer, and I don't know that I'd unload with all of that if I was floating a river with you, Randy, but anyway.
Well, I'll give you the chance to make it a shorter answer then. So we're wrapping up our float down the river, and I say, well, Shane, that's all great, but I'm an individual. Yeah. What are the benefits of me as an individual supporting or engaging in the Wild Harvest Initiative?
Well, organizations, companies, communities, families, they're all made up of individuals, aren't they? Yeah. Ultimately, every single one of these partnerships, I can assure you, is based on some individual in that state agency, some individual in that business, some individual in that NGO who saw the value and the purposefulness of this and was responsible for bringing that back to their organization and saying, you know what, I really think we should be involved in this. Mm-hmm. And it may not be for everybody, Randy. There's hardly any idea is for everybody. But in a way, I think, I would like to find a way for every hunter in Canada and the United States, and every angler eventually, every hunter in Canada and the United States to contribute to this. Mm-hmm. It could be just $1. Just to say that they support what is behind this kind of idea. And I bet you 99% of hunters, when this is explained to them, for example, would say,
I'm in.
And I don't see much. They certainly say I don't see anything wrong with this, and I think most of them will say that they see that there's something right with it. So, I think the individual, of course, everything is run by individuals in the world ultimately. But I think the value for the individual here is to see themselves as a part of this, because it wasn't because we had George Bird Grinnell and Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt and Ding Darling and on and on and on. It wasn't just because of those few, but as individuals they did a great deal. And without the individuals like them, we wouldn't be where we are. But of course, it's been the individual through time, and all of them through time, who are not remembered nor can be identified at a personal level, who have made this system work. It's not just because a small group of individuals set up a few ideas and then the money just rained down from heaven, right? So I think for the individual, there is definitely a space in this, and some of them can rightfully say, of course, as an individual, I am in support of some of the organizations that are involved, and of course that makes them feel good too. I think.
Well, I can assure you that as we get further down this path, I'll be promoting to my audience that, hey, where's your dollar? Where's your dollar, or where's your hour?
The more resource we can have to mobilize this, the better, because right now we have a lean, running sort of wolf. But what we need to do is to create something that looks more like a herd, like a pack of things that are out there moving this forward. And because this alone, in my view, this whole idea of transforming our attitudes, looking at landscapes as food provisioning systems, these are the kinds of things that think tanks are made of. I could even see a think tank coming out of this kind of effort by some group at some point in time. And don't forget that the disparities in our countries between different ethnic groups and different economic classes also feed into this or find this very interesting, because, of course, there is not a fully equitable distribution of engagement with this activity in Canada or the United States. And yet all people have an interest in, again, this idea of food. And so this is also a way, I think, of trying to encourage a much more diverse community of people from all kinds of different countries that have come to the United States or to Canada to live and to find opportunity. I think this is a way of encouraging them to become involved in this cultural aspect of our nations, in a way that if we were to speak to them about hunting in the absence of this food emphasis, it might seem a little,
pretty abstract.
Yes, exactly. But with the food, I think it changes that.